Hello, hello, this is Faceless Opinion. Welcome you back to another video. Death Note is one of my all-time favorite anime. This series gives us arguably one of the most powerful items in all of weeb culture, the Death Note itself. Being able to end someone's life just by writing down their name on one of the pages would definitely come off as an all-powerful item. That simply isn't the case, for the Death Note is governed by a set of rules that limit what is possible. So I think it would be an interesting discussion to go over all the rules, explain them, and maybe learn something that might not have been explored throughout the course of the series. Now, before we dive into all the technicalities, I want to establish a guideline of what it is we are going over. I will be going over the official rules that originate from the manga. I will not be going over the fake rules that Light created to mislead the Cure Task Force. I also will not go over the rules from the 2017 Netflix adaptation. Ew. The least said about that one, the better. With that out of the way, let's begin. We have a lot to go over. Rule 1. The human whose name is written in this note shall die. The note will not take effect unless the writer has the person's face in their mind when writing his or her name. Therefore, the person sharing the same name will not be affected. If the cause of death is written within the next 40 seconds of writing the person's name, it will happen. If the cause of death is not specified, the person will simply die of a heart attack. After writing the cause of death, details of the death should be written within the next 6 minutes and 40 seconds. Rule 2. This note shall become the property of the human world. Once it touches the ground of the human world, the owner of the note can recognize the image and voice of the original owner, i.e. a god of death. The human who uses this note can neither go to heaven nor hell. Rule 3. If the time of death is written within 40 seconds after writing the cause of death as a heart attack, the time of death can be manipulated, and the time can go into effect within 40 seconds after writing the name. The human who touches the Death Note can recognize the image and voice of its original owner, a god of death, even if the human is not the owner of the note. Rule 4. The person in possession of the Death Note is possessed by a god of death, its original owner, until they die. If a human uses the note, a god of death usually appears in front of him or her within 39 days after he or she uses the note. Gods of death, the original owners of the Death Note, do not do, in principle, anything which will help or prevent the deaths in the note. A god of death has no obligation to completely explain how to use the note or rules which will apply to the human who owns it unless asked. All those rules just now are self-explanatory. I don't really feel the need to go over them that much. It's pretty basic. It's just teaching you how to use it. It's easy. Rule 5. A god of death can extend their own life by putting a name on their own note, but humans cannot. A person can shorten his or her life by using the note. The human who becomes the owner of the Death Note can, in exchange of half of his or her remaining life, get the eyes of the god of death, which will enable him or her to see a human's name and remaining lifespan when looking through them. A god of death cannot be killed even if stabbed in his heart with a knife or shot in the head with a gun. However, there are ways to kill a god of death, which are not generally known to the god of death. Alright, this explains a little bit about the Shirogami, aka the gods of death, as well as the eyeball deal you can make with them. We see a fair share of characters make this deal. Misa would be our biggest example of the eyeballs being used. Rule 6. The conditions for death will not be realized unless it is physically possible for that human, or it is reasonably assumed to be carried out by that human. The specific scope of the condition for death is not known to the gods of death either, so you must examine and find out. In layman's terms, it has to be a death that can be considered realistic. For example, you can't have somebody die of a shark attack while they're sitting on the toilet. It's not really possible. Rule 7. One page taken from the Death Note, or even a fragment of the page, contains the full effects of the note. The instrument to write can be anything, cosmetics, blood, etc., as long as it can write directly onto the note and remains as legible letters. Even the original owners of Death Note, gods of death, do not know much about the note. We see countless examples of people keeping pages of the note on their person, the coolest being Light with his spy watch. I wish I had a watch like that. Rule 8. You may also write the cause and/or details of death prior to filling in the name of the individual. Be sure to insert the name in front of the written cause of death. You have about 19 days in order to fill in a name. Even if you do not actually possess the death note, the effect will be the same if you can recognize the person and his or her name to place in the blank. Rule 9. The death note will not affect those under 780 days old. The death note will be rendered useless if the victim's name is misspelled 4 times. You can't end the life of somebody who is younger than 2 years old. I'm not sure why you would want to, but you can't. And also spelling counts. Don't forget, I before E except after C. Rule 10. Suicide is a valid cause of death. Basically, all humans are thought to possess the possibility to commit suicide. It is, therefore, not something unbelievable to think of. While the cause of the individual's death is either a suicide or accident, if the death leads to the death of more than the intended, the person will simply die of a heart attack. This is to ensure that other lives are not influenced. Rule 11. Even after the individual's name, the time of death, and death condition on the death note were filled out, the time and condition of death can be altered as many times as you want, as long as it is changed within 6 minutes and 40 seconds from the time it was filled in. But of course, this is only possible before the victim dies. Whenever you want to change anything written on the death note within 6 minutes and 40 seconds after you wrote, you must first rule out the characters you want to erase with 2 straight lines. As you see above, the time and conditions of death can be changed, but once the victim's name has been written, the individual's death can never be avoided. Rule 12. If you lose the death note or have it stolen, you will lose its ownership unless you retrieve it within 490 days. If you have traded the eye power of a death god, you will lose the power as well as the memory of the death note once you lose its ownership. At the same time, the remaining half of your life will not be restored. Rule 13. You may lend the death note to another person while maintaining its ownership. Subletting it to yet another person is possible too. The borrower of the death note will not be followed by a god of death. The god of death always remains with the owner of the death note. Also, the borrower cannot trade the eyesight of the god of death. Rule 14. When the owner of the death note dies while the note is being lent, its ownership will be transferred to the person who is holding it at the time. If the death note is stolen and the owner is killed by the thief, the ownership will automatically be transferred to the thief. Rule 15. When the same name is written in more than 2 death notes, the note which was first filled in will take effect, regardless of the time of death. If writing the same name on more than 2 death notes is completed within 0.06 seconds, it is regarded as simultaneous. The death note will not take effect and the individual written will not die. The second half of that sounds a bit contrived, don't you think? The odds of that happening are laughable. But if that is able to happen, all I'm going to say is that maybe you should buy a lottery ticket. Rule 16. The god of death must at least own 1 death note. The death note must never be lent to or written on by a human. Exchanging and writing on the death note between the gods of death is no problem. Rule 17. If the god of death decides to use the death note to kill the assassin of an individual he favors, the individual's life will be extended, but the god of death will die. The dead god of death will disappear, but the death note will remain. The ownership of this death note is usually carried over to the next god of death that touches it or is kept in possession of the human owner of the death note. We saw this happen with Gellus, or as I call him, the Simpagami, when he saved Misa from her would-be murderer. The same thing also happened when Rem protected Misa as well. Now that I think about it, Misa must have some supernatural powers as she was able to make 2 Shiragami sacrifice themselves for her. Rule 18. Only by touching each other's death note can human individuals who own the death note in the human world recognize the appearance or voice of each other's god of death. An individual with the eye power of a god of death can tell the name and lifespan of other humans by looking at that person's face. By possessing the death note, an individual gains the ability to kill and stops being a victim. From this point, a person with the death note cannot see the lifespan of other Death Note owners, including him or herself, but it is not really necessary for the individual to view the lifespan of him or herself or other Death Note owners. The God of Death must not tell humans the names or lifespans of individuals he or she sees. This is to avoid confusion in the human world. Rule 19. It is prerequisite for the Death Note used in the human world that a living God of Death makes sure that the humans in the human world use it. It is very difficult to consider that a God of Death who has possessed a human could die, but if he should die, the Death Note that he brought into the human world will not lose its power. Rule 20. In order to see the names and lifespans of humans by using the eye power of the God of Death, the owner must look at more than half of that person's face. When looking from top to bottom, he must look at least from the head to the nose. If he looks at only the eyes and under, he will not be able to see the person's name and lifespan. Also, even though some parts of the face, for example the eyes, nose, or mouth, are hidden, he can basically see the whole face. He will be able to see the person's name and lifespan. It is not clear how much exposure is needed to tell a person's name and lifespan, as this needs to be verified. If above conditions are met, names and lifespans can be seen through photos and pictures, no matter how old they are, but this is sometimes influenced by the vividness and size. Also, names and lifespans cannot be seen by face drawings, however realistic they may be. Rule 21. Those with the eye power of the God of Death will have the eyesight of over 3.6 in the human measurement, regardless of their original eyesight. Wait a minute, are you telling me that Shirogami eyes also give enhanced vision? Okay, that's actually pretty cool. I didn't know that. Rule 22. The individuals who lose the ownership of the Death Note will also lose their memory of the usage of the Death Note. This does not mean that he will lose all the memory from the day he owned it to the day he lost possession, but means he will only lose the memory involving the Death Note. Rule 23. Whenever an individual with ownership of more than 2 Death Notes lose possession of one of the Death Notes, he will not be able to recognize that Death Note's God of Death's appearance or voice anymore. The God of Death himself will leave, but all the memory involving that Death Note will remain as long as he maintains ownership of at least one other Death Note. Rule 24. The God of Death must not stay in the human world without a particular reason. Conditions to stay in the human world are as follow. 1. When the God of Death's Death Note is handed to a human. 2. Essentially finding a human to pass on the Death Note should be done from the world of the Gods of Death, but if it is within 82 hours, this may also be done in the human world. 3. When a God of Death stalks an individual with the intention to kill them, as long as it is within 82 hours of haunting them, the God of Death may stay in the human world. Rule 25. The God of Death must not hand the Death Note directly to a child under 6 years of age based on the human calendar. The Death Note must not be handed to a child under 6 years of age, but Death Notes that have been dropped into the human world and are part of the human world can be used upon humans of any age with the same effect. Rule 26. If you just write "die of accident" for the cause of death, the victim will die from a natural accident after 6 minutes and 40 seconds from the time of writing it. Even though only one name is written in the Death Note, if it influences and causes other humans that are not written in it to die, the victim's cause of death will be a heart attack. Rule 27. If you write "die of disease" with a specific disease's name and the person's time of death, there must be a sufficient amount of time for the disease to progress. If the set time is too tight, the victim will die of a heart attack after 6 minutes and 40 seconds after completing the Death Note. If you write "die of disease" for the cause of death, but only write a specific time of death without the actual name of disease, the human will die from an adequate disease, but the Death Note can only operate within 23 days. This is called the 23-day rule. Rule 28. If you write "die of disease" like before with a specific disease's name but without a specific time, if it takes more than 24 days for the human to die, the 23-day rule will not take effect and the human will die at an adequate time depending on the disease. When rewriting the cause and or details of death, it must be done within 6 minutes and 40 seconds. You cannot change the victim's time of death, however soon it may be. Rule 29. You cannot kill humans at the age of 124 or over with the Death Note. You cannot kill humans with less than 12 minutes of life left in human calculations. I don't think anyone in real life has lived for 124 years old. The oldest I could find was 122, so no one is really exempt from that one. I also find it interesting that you can't write down someone's name if they're already near death. I guess the Shirogami don't believe in mercy killings? Rule 30. If you have traded the eye power of a god of death, you will see a person's primary lifespan in the human world. The names you will see with the eye power of a god of death are the names needed to kill that person. You will be able to see the names even if that person isn't registered in the family registry. Rule 31. The number of pages of the Death Note will never run out. Max ammo! Rule 32. If someone possesses more than one Death Note, by visualizing the victim, then writing down the name in one of the Death Notes and the cause of death in the other, it will take effect. The order, however, is unimportant. If you write down the cause of death in one Death Note and afterwards write the name in the other, it will take effect. This can also be accomplished by two Death Note owners working together. In this case, it is necessary that the two touch each other's Death Notes. Rule 33. If a person loses possession of a Death Note, they will not recognize the gods of death by sight or voice anymore. If, however, the owner lets someone else touch his Death Note, from that time on, that person will recognize the god of death. In accordance with the above, the human who touched the Death Note and began to recognize the gods of death's image and voice will continue to recognize it until that human actually owns the Death Note and subsequently loses possession of it. Rule 34. The owner of the Death Note cannot be killed by a god of death who is living in the world of the gods of death. Also, a god of death who comes to the human world in the objective to kill the owner of the Death Note will not be able to do so. Only a god of death that has passed on their Death Note to a human is able to kill the owner of the Death Note. That means the only Shirogami that can kill Light is Ryuk. No one else. That means when Rem threatened Light to save Misa, she was only bluffing, for she isn't capable of doing anything to Light. Rule 35. If a Death Note owner accidentally misspells a name 4 times, that person will be free from being killed by the Death Note. However, if they intentionally misspell the name 4 times, the Death Note owner will die. The person whose name was misspelled 4 times on purpose will not be free of death by a Death Note. I don't understand why someone would intentionally misspell the name of someone they would want dead. On accident, maybe, but 4 times? Come on, people. Don't forget your spelling rules. A, E, I, O, U, and sometimes Y. Rule 36. There are male and female gods of death, but it is neither permitted nor possible for them to have sexual relations with humans. The gods of death also cannot have sex with each other. If that's the case, then the Simpagami should know better. Rule 37. When regaining ownership of the Death Note, the memories associated with the Death Note will also return. In cases where you are involved with other Death Notes as well, memories of all the Death Notes involved will return. Even without obtaining ownership, memories will return just by touching the Death Note. Rule 38. If you lose memory of the Death Note when losing its ownership, but you can regain this memory by either obtaining the ownership once again or by touching the Death Note. This can be done up to 6 times per Death Note. If the 6 times are exceeded, the person's memory of the Death Note will not return, and they will have to use it without any previous memory of it. Rule 39. Humans that have traded the eye power of a god of death will see a person's primary lifespan and will not be influenced by the Death Note. If the victim is killed using the Death Note, the remaining lifetime of that victim will be provided to the god of death. Rule 40. Humans that have traded for the eye power of a god of death cannot see the name or lifespan of humans who have already passed away by looking at their photos. That makes sense. If they're already dead, why would you really need to know that information? Rule 41. Whenever a god of death who had been the human world dies, the Death Note is left behind and is picked up by a human. That person becomes the owner. However, in this case, only the human that can recognize the god of death and its voice is able to see and touch the Death Note. It is very unlikely, but if by any chance a god of death picks up the Death Note, that god of death becomes the owner. Rule 42. The names you see with the eye power of a god of death are the names needed to kill that person. You will be able to see their names even if they aren't listed in a family registry. The use of the Death Note in the human world sometimes affects other humans' lives or shortens their original lifespan, even though their names are not actually written in the Death Note itself. In these cases, no matter the cause, the God of Death sees only the original lifespan and not the shortened version. Rule 43. It is useless trying to erase names written in the Death Note with erasers or whiteout. If a Death Note is owned in the human world against that God of Death's will, that God of Death is permitted to stay in the human world in order to retrieve it. In that case, there are other Death Notes in the human world. The gods of Death are not allowed to reveal to humans that Death Note owner or its location. If you write someone's name in the Death Note, you need to be 100% sure about it. No take-backsies. Rule 44. If the Death Note that the God of Death owns is taken away by being cheated by other gods of Death and so forth, it can only be retrieved from the God of Death who possesses it at the time. If there is no God of Death but a human possessing it, the only way the God of Death can retrieve it will be to first touch the Death Note and become the God of Death that hunts the human. Then wait until that human dies to take it away before any other human touches it, or whenever the human shows a will to let it go. We actually see this happen when Ryuk steals Shido's Death Note, leading to Shido going to the human world trying to reclaim it from Mello and his mafia. Rule 45. As long as the God of Death has at least once seen a human and knows his or her name and lifespan, the God of Death is capable of finding that human from a hole in the world of the gods of Death. The hole connects both the human and Shirogami worlds, but only the Shirogami can pass through, so don't even think about trying to sneak inside of there. Yet again, why would you want to? To be honest, the realm kinda looks like crap. Rule 46. There are laws in the world of gods of death. If a god of death should break the law, there are 9 levels of severity starting at level 8 and going up to level 1 plus the extreme level. For severity levels above 3, the god of death will be killed after being punished. For example, killing a human without using the Death Note is considered as the extreme level. So don't expect Ryuk to get into a fist fight with Light for a bunch of apples, no matter how much we would want to see that. Rule 47. Losing memory of the Death Note by passing on the ownership to another or by abandoning its ownership will only occur when someone is actually killed using the Death Note. You will not lose memory of the Death Note, for example, if you merely owned it and had not written anyone's name. In this case, you will not be able to hear the voice or see the figure of the God of Death anymore. You will also lose the eye power of the God of Death you traded with. Rule 48. The God of Death will not die from lack of sleep. Moreover, gods of death do not really need sleep. The meaning of sleep for gods of death is essentially different from humans and is merely laziness. Especially gods of death living in the human world that have passed on their Death Note shouldn't be lazy, as they are required to see the death of the human, but it is not that they are not allowed to sleep. Rule 49. Only 6 Death Notes are allowed to exist at a time in the human world. Of course, the Death Note that the God of Death owns does not count. That means only 6 gods of death that have passed on their Death Note to humans can stay in the human world. Rule 50. One god of death is allowed to pass on Death Notes to only 3 humans at a time. It is possible for a single god of death to hand out up to 6 Death Notes, for example, by handing 3 humans 2 Death Notes each. In other words, 1 human could own all 6 Death Notes. Rule 51. However, if a 7th Death Note is owned by a human in the human world, nothing will happen even if used. Rule 52. In the event that there are more than 6 Death Notes in the human world, only the first 6 Death Notes that have been delivered to humans will have effect. The 7th Death Note will not become active until one of the other 6 Death Notes are burned up or a god of death takes one of them back to the world of the gods of death. Rule 53. The Death Note will not take effect if you write a specific victim's name using several different pages, but the front and back of a page is considered as one page. For example, the Death Note will still take effect if you write the victim's surname on the front page and given name on the back. Rule 54. In order to make the Death Note take effect, the victim's name must be written on the same page, but the cause of death and situation around the death can be described in other pages of Death Note. This will work as long as the person that writes in the Death Note keeps the specific victim's name in mind when writing the cause and situation of death. Rule 55. In occasions where the cause and situation of death is written before the victim's name, Multiple names can be written as long as they are written within 40 seconds, and the causes and situations of death are not impossible to occur. In the occasion where the cause of death is possible, but the situation is not, only the cause of death will take effect for the victim. If both the cause and the situation are impossible, that victim will die of a heart attack. Rule 56. When you write multiple names in the death note and then write down even one cause of death within 40 human seconds from writing the first victim's name, the cause will take effect for all the names written. Also, after writing the cause of death, even if the situation of death is written within 6 minutes and 40 seconds in the human world, this situation will only occur to the victims whom it is possible. For those where the situation is not possible, only the cause of death will occur. Rule 57. In the death note, you cannot set the death date longer than the victim's original lifespan, even if the victim's death is set in the death note beyond his or her original lifespan. The victim will die before the set time. For example, you can't artificially lengthen someone's life to say that they die of old age if in reality that they're not supposed to live up till their elder years. Rule 58. By manipulating the death of a human that has influence over another human's life, that human's original lifespan can sometimes be lengthened. If a god of death intentionally does the above manipulation to effectively lengthen a human's lifespan, the god of death will die. But even if a human does the same, the human will not die. Simp-agami. Enough said. Rule 59. A human death caused by the death note will indirectly lengthen some other human's original life, even without a specific intention to lengthen a particular person's original lifespan in the human world. Rule 60. After a god of death has brought the death note to the human world and given its ownership to a human, that god of death has the right to kill the human using his or her own death note for reasons such as disliking the owner. The moral of this rule is don't be a dick. Rule 61. Even if a new victim's name, cause of death, or situation of death is written on top of the originally written name, cause of death, or situation of death, there will be no effect on the original victim's death. The same thing will also apply to erasing what was written with a pencil or whiting out what was written with a pen in an attempt to rewrite it. Rule 62. Once the victim's name, cause of death, and situation of death have been written down in the death note, this death will still take place even if that death note or the part of the note in which has been written is destroyed, for example, burned into ashes before the stated time of death. If the victim's name has been written and then the death note is destroyed in the middle of writing the cause of death, the victim will be killed by a heart attack in 40 seconds after writing the name. If the victim's name and cause of death have been written in the middle of writing the situation of death, then the victim will be killed within 6 minutes and 40 seconds via the stated cause of death if the cause is possible within that period of time, but otherwise the victim will die by heart attack. Rule 63. No matter what medical or scientific method may be employed, it is impossible for humans to distinguish whether or not the human has the eye power of a god of death. Even gods of death cannot distinguish this fact, except for the very god of death that traded his or her eye power with that human. Rule 64. The following situations are the cases where a god of death that has brought the death note into the human world is allowed to return to the world of the gods of death. 1. When the god of death has seen the end of the first owner of the death note brought into the human world and has written that human's name on his or her own death note. 2. When the death note which has been brought in is destroyed, like burned, and cannot be used by humans anymore. 3. If nobody claims ownership of the death note and it is unnecessary to hunt anyone anymore. 4. If, for any reason, the god of death possessing the death note has been replaced by another god of death. 5. When the god of death loses track of the death note which he or she possesses, cannot identify which human is owning the death note, or cannot locate where the owner is, and therefore needs to find such information through the hole in the world of the gods of death. Even in the situations 2, 3, and 4 above, gods of death are obligated to confirm the death of the first owner and write down that human's name in his or her death note, even when he or she is in the world of the gods of death. Rule 65. In the world of gods of death, there are a few copies of what humans may call user guidebook for using the death note in the human world. However, the guidebook is not allowed to be delivered to humans. it is perfectly okay for Gods of Death to read the guidebook for him or herself and teach humans about its contents, no matter what the content may be. This raises some questions. Are the rules in the guidebook the same with the rules that are inside the Death Note? If not, then what are the differences? I thought these rules listed within the Death Note would be considered a guidebook. I'm confused now. Can someone explain this to me? Rule 66. Some limited number of Death Notes have white or red front covers, but they would make no difference in their effects as compared with the black cover Death Notes. And finally, Rule 67. Regarding the memories mentioned in Rule 47, the owner can have their memories of the Death Note erased if they so desire. A God of Death should stay near the owner of the Death Note, but they may go as far away as 14 kilometers. A human who buys or sells the Death Note will die. Now we have some extra information. These aren't really rules per se, but I think they are worth bringing up nonetheless. All humans will, without exception, eventually die. After they die, the place they go to is MU. Once dead, they can never come back to life. Okay, that should be everything. Every rule listed. All of them are self-explanatory, which was the reason why I didn't go into detail for all of them. They speak for themselves. You will definitely notice throughout the course of it that some of the rules repeat themselves, most likely to emphasize the importance that these rules play in the Death Note universe. I think that this was a fairly good read and quite educational. There were things I had no idea that were even a thing. I will put in a link in the description to where I found these rules in case anybody wants to look them over. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, leave a comment and tell me what you thought about the rules, and until next time, I will catch you all on the flip side.